Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is the Casual Friday podcast. In this week's podcast, I'm going to tell you about some events I'm looking forward to in the near future, some dyeing experiments for my handspun sweater, and a finalized design for that sweater. I have another knitting project, plus I have some sewing projects I want to share with you. So let's get started. Every year I kind of set some goals for myself of what I want to do in my knitting life. Just kind of reflecting back, what did I do the previous year? What would I want to do more of or in a different way? What do I want to do less of? And what do I want to try for the first time? So my first year of doing Casual Friday, Casual Friday started because I wanted to do more with my video life. I had been doing technique videos every week for a year, and I just had more to say about knitting than what I could teach in a 10, 15-minute video. I wanted to talk about what I was learning and not maybe do a video that was about me teaching something. It wouldn't mean that I would never be teaching, but it wouldn't be a tutorial. So just had this idea of a second type of video. I also had a goal of getting out in the knitting community more, meeting other knitters, maybe taking classes, just getting more involved in the guild, and just getting out there and meeting other knitters locally. The knitting groups I'd been involved in, our kids were all similar ages, and when they all graduated, we went our separate ways. I had not been teaching in a yarn shop. The yarn shop where I had been teaching had closed, which is why I started doing Technique Tuesdays. And I really missed just talking about knitting with other knitters. So I wanted to have the video, but I wanted to go out in the community. And then the third thing I wanted to do was to experience yarns that were made from a variety of wool breeds, not just the same ones that I was always knitting with. And it took me a while to realize the reason I wasn't knitting with other wool breeds was because there really wasn't that much out in the different yarn shops. This is 2018, and there just wasn't much out there. So I thought, well, I'm going to go to our local Shepherd's Harvest in the spring. It's our local wool festival. Maybe that's where I could buy some yarn from different breeds, because before I'd always seen it as, you know, if you wanted to buy raw fleece and spin, and I wasn't a spinner. I mean, there were like booths with that yarn shops had, or indie dyers, and I'm just not much of a yarn shopper. I need to know what I'm going to use a yarn for and then go look for it. So it never works out if I just say, oh, that's a pretty yarn, and I buy it. It just sits on my shelf. I never use it. I have to have a plan for the yarn. So I went to Shepherd's Harvest and I didn't find yarn. But what I did find was a booth where there was a display of washed long locks. So these were things you could incorporate into your spinning. So they were little 1 ounce, but they were washed, and you could see the difference from one breed to another. And I thought, oh, I need to learn to spin, because I'd been avoiding learning to spin prior to that. I just didn't have an interest in it. I'm like, it's not going to do me any good just to use a yarn and try to observe that difference. I need to spin. I need to go the whole process. And that was I had to leave the festival because it was so disorienting for me to even changed my mind about, because I had just been, I'm not learning. I don't want to know about spinning. I had been focused on the Master Hand Knitting program. I didn't want to get distracted. I had been done with the Master Hand Knitting program at this point by 6 years, but it was just my habit to not learn anything about spinning. So I learned to spin, and it was interesting, but I didn't fall in love with it. Like, that had been my fear before, that I would fall in love with spinning and that would distract me from my knitting. And I found it interesting, and I still find it interesting, and I like it a lot more. But it took me a good 5 years until last summer to like, oh, I actually enjoy this. And I think so much of it has to do with, I start with my idea for a project, and then I pick the yarn. And with spinning, it takes a while to get to the point where you can have enough control over your yarn that you can say, this is the yarn I want for my project, and then spin it. And then it takes a while to do the spinning. You know, it takes a long time to spin a sweater's quantity of yarn. And I wasn't going to do that at the beginning. And I had limited use for small quantities, like 4 ounces. Like, how many hats do I need? Or cowls or whatever. So I didn't really fall in love with spinning like I'd have been afraid, but I learned a lot about how yarn is constructed. And then last summer, I'm like, oh, I really like this. And so I spun the sweaters quantity, but it's still not like a daily thing, but it's something that I like enough that I feel like, oh, I can do this. I am seeing this through. One of the goals that I had for this year was to go to one of the big festivals, either Rhinebeck or Maryland Sheep and Wool. One of the things I worry about is just the sort of the overwhelm, like having it just like not being able to take it in. Like, I don't have social anxiety. I'm not afraid to be in a crowd. It's like being in the crowd, but seeing what there is to see and just going through that. Even with our smaller festival here, I have to go through the vendor barns several times before I can actually start seeing what's there, because it's just too much. And so that was my concern about it. But I have a friend who lives in Washington, D.C., and she goes to Maryland Sheep and Wool every year, and she was talking about it a couple of months ago, and I said, oh, I really want to go. And she goes, oh, come and stay with me. So I'm going to fly out to D.C. at the beginning of May, stay with her, and we're going to go to Maryland Sheep and Wool. The festival's on Saturday and Sunday, and she goes every year. She's like, Saturday is just so crowded. She says, I go on Sunday, it's not as crowded. And then we can take advantage of Embassy Week in Washington, D.C. So on Saturday, the embassies open up and you can go to them and they have food, and it's all free. And you can just go to the different embassies, and we're going to do like a little tasting tour of the embassies. The following weekend will be the European embassies. The weekend I'll be there would be the world embassies. So a variety of continents and countries and will be represented. So that's one thing I'm really excited about. The other thing that I heard about last year when I was at a spinners event, I knew about it and I was keeping my eyes open for it so that I could sign up for this opportunity. It's called A Year with the Sheep, and it's put on by Get Bent's Farm. She's the farmer and the mini mill who produce the fiber that I am spinning, that I spun into the sweater quantity of yarn that I'm going to make into a sweater. So it's called Year with the Sheep, and you go to her farm, I think just about like every other month, and kind of learn more about the whole process of sheep, raising the lambs, the whole cycle, and then at some point I'll get to pick a lamb and whose fleece I want, and then I'll be there for the shearing of that. So the lambs are being born right now, and so next weekend, my friend Elizabeth, who's my spinning friend, she signed up for it too. We're going to go down and we get to cuddle with the lambs next weekend. So that will be our first time for our Year with the Sheep. So I'm really excited about that. But if you're going to be at Maryland Sheep and Wool, I'm going to be there on Sunday wandering around. So if you see me, say hi. So that's my excitement, the events I'm excited about coming up in the next couple of weeks. So back in the beginning of March, I went to our guild's knitting retreat, and one of the women there, Betsy, had just finished a sweater, a cardigan, and she was showing it off, and I was looking at the inside of it, and I saw that she had done something different with her button bands in terms of supporting them than I had ever seen before, and I thought I wanted to try it. And then when I got home, I realized I really wanted to try it on this sweater. This is a sweater I knit a few years back, and there were a number of things I had to change while I was knitting this sweater and then after I finished it. Just things I've modified to it. It was a sweater, it was a lot of work. I like it a lot in many respects, but it was by no means perfect. And over time, the button bands had gotten really bad. And to the point where I would never wear this sweater out in public because it looked so bad. So I want to kind of show you what it looked like and compare it to some other button bands, show you what I did on the inside, and then reveal the finished results, because I'm really happy with the way this turned out. Sometimes button bands need to be stabilized, sometimes they don't. In the case of these two sweaters, I did not stabilize the button bands for either one, and this one is just fine. I've had it for years. I wear it a lot. It's not a problem. I didn't need any stabilization. This sweater, however, you can see this button right here, how much it's pulling. So it's a combination of factors that have made this sweater fine without any stabilization, and this one has been a problem. So what I want to do is take the buttons off of this sweater, mark their location, wash and block the sweater so that I can get the button band back in shape, and then do some stabilization on the bands so that that behavior won't happen. I'm going to do it. There are a few ways that you can do the stabilization, in particular how you handle the stabilization with buttonholes. I've tried a bunch of different ways, and I'm going to try a new way today that I think could work really well. So these two sweaters were knit a few years ago. I'm going to say within the past 5 years. I could be wrong, but they were knit approximately the same time period. The button bands are quite different, like the behavior of the button bands. This one is hanging very straight, and this one has a lot of waviness to it. They're both knit with Knit 1 Purl 1 ribbing, but this one was knit perpendicularly. This one was knit in the direction of the body. This sweater hits at my hips, so when I sit down, it's not pulling. This one goes past my hips, so when it's buttoned and I'm sitting, it pulls on this. And so I get this kind of waviness right here. So I didn't use ribbon to stabilize the button band on this sweater, and it doesn't need it. In part, it's because of the combination of qualities of the sweater, the yarn, the buttons, all of that together meant that it hasn't needed to be stabilized. Here's another cardigan that also has a button band that's Knit 1 Purl 1 that was knit in the direction that the sweater was knit, just like this one. And it is stabilized and with ribbon, and it doesn't have any gaping or pulling on it. I think the biggest problem with this button band is that because it was knit in this direction in ribbing, when the ribbing is relaxed, it will pull in. It looks pretty much like stockinette, but it will take any excuse to stretch in this direction. And so when there is any pulling on it, that's what it's going to do. This fabric, because it's heavily cabled, doesn't stretch as much. It will stretch, it just doesn't stretch as much. So the sweater is taking the opportunity to stretch where there's openings here, and that's what I want to rectify. So what I did on this was I used 2 thinner pieces of ribbon, and I just ran them up on either side of this. I'm not completely sure that this is going to solve the problem because it can still pull in between here. We'll see. If I need to, I can always sew another thing of thin between each of these buttonholes all the way up if I decide I need to, but it's much more stable. And the really nice thing is on this side, I have the wider button band and I re-sewed the buttons. And these buttons are metal, they're very heavy. And that was part of the problem with this. They were just such heavy buttons, they were pulling the button band down. And then you had this, no stabilization on this side, and it was really pulling wide. So I'm much happier with this. It is better than it was. That has been our motto in this house for the past few years. Let's just make it better than it was. If it's not perfect, that's okay. And if we need to, we'll improve it again in the future. But for now, it's better than it was. And I've also reblocked the sweater. And one of the issues with this sweater was that it was smaller in circumference at the hips. It comes way down on the hips, and it was about 4 inches smaller in circumference than I had expected because the schematic showed one circumference, and that circumference was the full chest circumference. But that was what that circumference was after these gussets had been knit in. So if I had known that, I would have picked a body size that was just bigger and not even done the gussets, because that's not where I need additional room typically. So I need it down here. And because of the gauge was based on, you know, one of the cable patterns, and it's very heavily cabled, I didn't really have a sense of how big around this was until I realized when I got to the gusset what was going on. So, but I have lost weight in the past year, and so this does fit me better now, so I don't think there's going to be as much pulling. I don't know if when I'm sitting, I'm going to want to have this buttoned. I never have before because it was just too much. This is the button I'm going to be looking at. If I keep this open when I'm sitting, is to see what happens with this one. So I'm going to go to back to face to the camera, and then you can see what this looks like on me. All right, so this is what the sweater looks like on. It really needed to be blocked. That really helped. But I've got it buttoned all the way down to the bottom. It goes around my hips just fine. I don't know that I'm going to sit down with this around my hips like that. Well, you know, that might encourage it to start pulling. But I like it so far. If I find that it does continue pulling too much, then I can always add another bit of thin ribbon in between those buttons. And I might only need to do that down below where the pulling is more of a problem, or tends to be more of a problem. We're at the end of the winter now. We've had such a mild winter. I've hardly worn this sweater anyway. I don't think I'll get much wear out of it this spring, but it's washed and blocked and improved and ready for next winter. I wanted to mention too that I think when you have Knit One Purl One ribbing knit in the same direction as the body, that does encourage the ribbing to pull wide, and those kinds of bands probably really do need some kind of a support, more so than other types of bands might. So the sort of pinkish colored sweater that I was wearing at the beginning of the segment, that one was knit with a bulky weight yarn, but it was a chainette yarn. So it weighed half as much as it would have weighed if it had been applied yarn. It's just a very light yarn. Then the button band was knit in this direction, and the buttons themselves were very light, so they weren't dragging on the button band at all. This sweater had the Knit One Purl One in this direction. It had no support. It was applied yarn, so it's heavier to begin with, and then the buttons were really heavy. So they are very different situations, but it sort of informs me about what I will do in a future project in terms of adding support. It also has given me some ideas about other ways to form buttonholes in a grosgrain ribbon without having to sew them in ahead of time and getting the spacing exactly right. So it's opened my horizons, but ultimately, I'm really happy with the improvement of this particular sweater. So for the past year and a few months, I've been working on a long-term project to look at kind of the evolution of hand knit socks and stockings. It's similar to my sweater project that I did, where I knit a sweater from each decade. It spans a much larger time frame, and so I'm kind of looking at different centuries or different landmarks. So I've done a replica of the first extant, the oldest extant stocking in Europe. It was a baby stocking found in a Dutch canal, and it dates back to like 1580 something, I believe. I did a Tudor era stocking, which was really interesting, only in the knit stitch. The heel there wasn't like a heel flap and turn. There was just like a turn, and it was in garter stitch because they didn't know the purl stitch yet. It hadn't gotten that far north. I did a replica of Gunnister Man's stocking. He was it was a bog body found in Shetland in the 1950s, but he had died in 1700, and he had disintegrated, but all his wool stuff, because wool is acidic and so is the ground, the wool stuff was fine. So I knit a stocking based on the description of those and then comparing it to the photographs in museums. I reverse engineered one of our guild members, has her great-grandmother's stockings from 1890 when she immigrated from Germany. And so I reverse engineered those and knit one of those. I feel like I'm missing something, but what I'm doing right now is I'm knitting a stocking that's from the oldest known published pattern, stocking pattern. And it was in this large book for like housekeeping, basically, called Natura Exenerata, I think. I'll put the name of it on here and a link. You can see it. So the pattern was originally on over 3 pages, all one sentence, and for decades, no sort of knitting scholars could really work out how to make a stocking that was going to be proportioned or work out correctly. And Chris Lanning, she wrote an article for Piecework 10, 12 years ago, where she didn't look at how anybody else interpreted it. She was just going to follow the instructions and see where they led her. And she really found only maybe a couple of places where it was an obvious error, like 2 lines were printed twice, or there were these decorative clocks on the sides of the stocking where the instructions were not quite symmetrical. So, but otherwise she knit it as they were written, and she came up with stockings. So I thought, I'm just going to follow her instructions. So that's my current stocking. Last time I was telling you a little bit about this, and I had bought some yarn when we were down in Chicago for my birthday. That was like my plan, was I want to get yarn. I want to go to this yarn shop. It sounded interesting, and I'm going to look for this yarn. And I bought yarn that turned out to be just a little too heavy. I would have had to change the gauge and all that, and I didn't really want to do that. I wanted to get something that I could work at the correct gauge. So I did find some Knit Picks yarn, and it had something interesting on the label, which I'd never seen before. Let me go get the label. The yarn is called High Desert. It's a sport weight. Then it says quail. Oh, maybe that's the color? The color is quail. So it's this kind of gray color. And I was looking to see, what kind of yarn it was, and it says 100% USA grown Shaniko wool, or Shaniko wool. And I thought, is that a breed? Because I've never heard of it. I didn't know what it was. Well, it turns out it's an organization that started in Shaniko, Oregon. And it's a way to certify like farms, like shepherds, that are using regenerative practices and all of that, and that's all US grown. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. It's a really nice yarn. I don't know, it just says USA grown and spun yarn, so it didn't get shipped anywhere to get made or dyed, but I have no idea, like it must just come from like a wool bank or whatever they call it, where everybody just sends their wool to the same place and all gets blended together. But it feels, nice. It's not scratchy at all. I like it, and it's working well for this stocking. This is not going to be an interesting stocking to knit. It might have been more interesting to me if I had tried to knit it from the original instructions. It's just a tube, and there's been some increases and decreases, and it's just going to be a long leg. And then it'll get interesting at the ankles, where there's a little bit of a stitch pattern for the clocks, and then I get to turn the heel and make the foot, and I'll go a lot faster. So this is definitely knitting group knitting, where it's just stockinette in the rounds. This is probably going to take me a while. And like the other stockings, it's just going to be one. The exception, I did knit a sock from the 1940s, 2 of them actually, using this Aladdin heel as this replaceable sock heel. And I promised I would do a Technique Tuesday on that heel. It's a heel flap and gusset construction, but it's replaceable. So I do need to do that. This is just going to be pretty mindless, but it'll be interesting just to see what this stocking from the very first published pattern ends up being like. My Handspun Sweater project is a long-term project. I often talk about my long-term project to knit a sweater from each decade. It took me 4 years, and I knit like 8 sweaters. Or this stocking evolution thing, and so I knit one of those every couple of months. Handspun Sweater is quite a long-term project. I started last summer, spinning some Wham. It's a wool alpaca mohair blend from Get Bent's farm. She's the local. She's in Northfield, which is about 45 minutes, maybe an hour south of here. And I loved it so much. I bought more of it because I was able to get exactly the yarn that I was hoping to spin. Like, it was the first time I could say, I've been able to say, I want to spin a yarn that's like this, and then I did it. So I was really happy, and I really enjoyed the spinning process. It just, spinning really clicked with me with this particular project. So I thought, well, this is the project to knit a sweater's quantity. So I bought more of the wool. I spun for a while in the fall, took a break during the winter, and then finished up the spinning in February. And the whole time I was thinking about what do I want the sweater to be? I knew I was gonna design it myself. I wasn't gonna try to find a pattern and then make that yarn fit that pattern. I was waiting to see what the yarn was, and then make decisions about the sweater. And this is really hard for me because I've always been the kind of knitter that I come up with my idea for what I want the project to be, and then I just go buy the yarn, and usually it's a 4-ply worsted spun, worsted weight yarn in a solid color, because what I like to play with is like texture. And in this case, I was spinning a woolen spun yarn, which is softer and has less definition. It's going to be warmer. Didn't really want to compete with the yarn. I really wanted the yarn to be the focus of the sweater, but I didn't want it just to be the gray. It's a pretty gray. I mean, it's a medium kind of gray. You know, there's different tonalities in it of the gray. But I knew that I wanted to dye some quantity of it. And so last time I was showing you, I had dyed some of it this beautiful teal. And once I saw this, then I thought, oh, I might want to make a gradient and, progressively lighter colors of this. But I couldn't dye that. I knew how I was going to dye it, but I couldn't do the dyeing until I had really finalized my decisions about the sweater. Like, I knew it was going to be top down, set in sleeve. It's not usually how I like to knit my sweaters. I usually like to knit bottom up in pieces, flat and seam them, or at least do the body bottom up and then the sleeves top down. Just, with dyeing yarn and not being sure how long it's going to last and, whatever, that I thought top down made more sense in this situation. So I needed to figure out what I want to do. And I thought, well, with this gradient, I would do stripes of some kind, but I didn't know how wide they were going to be. I didn't know how much of the sweater would be these stripes and how much of it would be the original gray. And I had dyed quite a bit of this in this color, 75 grams, because it was going to be the contrast color of all the cuffs and the collar and stuff. And I wanted there to be enough of that. The button bands always take up way more yarn than you think they're going to. I knew that if I did these other colors, I probably couldn't do 75 grams. So I needed to know how much I needed. So I spent some time, few days, playing with different striping patterns and how I wanted the gradients to lay out. And so I came up with a couple of ideas. The main idea that I kind of locked into was that the stripes would only be 2 rows long, and I'd space them 6 or 7 rows apart with gray. And, I wanted the gradient to move, but I didn't know how I wanted to, and I thought, okay, since they're thin enough, I can move from dark to light to dark to light. And so I laid that out one way, but I realized, oh, if I do it this way, the darkest and the lightest aren't going to show up as much. If I do 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 1 and 5, the darkest and the lightest, are only going to show up half as often. And since the darkest is one I have a lot of yarn with, I didn't want to do that. So I rethought it, and I thought, okay, so what I'll do is 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 1, like that. So that anytime you have the darkest or the lightest, you do 2 stripes in a row. And I laid that out, and I like the way it looks, on my screen. These are not exactly the same colors that what I have. But then I could figure out, okay, if I'm having that many stripes for the body, because with my row gauge, I can figure out how many rows I'm going to have and therefore how many stripes, and the sleeves will have them at the same regular. So I could figure out kind of the maximum I would need, and then add a little bit more for that. So I figured out that I really only needed about 15 grams. I did the calculations over and over, and I'm so worried that I did them wrong, but I have more dye solution, and the stripes will be separated. If I have to dye some more, because I didn't dye enough, it will be close enough in color, and they will be far enough apart from each other, the stripes themselves, that it won't be noticeable. The way that dyeing works is you create a 1% solution of a particular color, and then just depending on how intense you want that color, you can use more or less of it. So the formula is that you have 1 gram of dye powder, and you add enough water to it, you dissolve it in enough water to give you 100 milliliters. And so then the dye is 1% of that 100 milliliters that you have. The dye makes up 1% of that. If you are somebody who's dyeing yarn and you have certain colorways and whatever, then you really want to be precise. It's really important to do it that way. And you can't assume that, oh, well, 99 milliliters is what I need, because things dissolve differently. If you're not trying to replicate dye lots, you can get close enough. So I finally, I was trying to get really, really close. I had 3 grams of dye powder, and I was, adding water a little bit at a time so I could just get up to 300. And then I ran out of water in my container, and then I ended up pouring, getting some more and pouring too much, and then I went up to 307, and I'm like, oh no. And I'm like, it does not matter. Just pretend it's close enough. So I had 300 milliliters plus a few milliliters, 300 milliliters of 1% dye solution. So if I wanted the most intense color, this one, for every gram of wool I wanted to dye, I would use 1 milliliter of the 1% solution. So I had 75 grams of yarn, so I used 75 milliliters of this dye solution. So then I figured out, well, I really only need 15 grams of each of these other colors. So that would mean if I was going to dye it the full strength, I would have 15 milliliters of the dye solution for my 15 grams. But I didn't want it to be full strength. I wanted it to be 20% lighter. So I took the 15 milliliters of the full intensity, and I multiplied it by 0.8. So I would have 80% of it. So what is that? 8 plus 4, 12. So I had 12 milliliters for this one. And then I had, I think, 9 milliliters for the next one, 6 for the next one, and then 3 milliliters for this one. I'm really pleased with how the gradient worked out. I will do an overhead shot so you can see all of it next to each other, but I'm really happy with how it worked out. I'm so pleased. So the next thing I need to do, I know all my stitch counts, like how many stitches around I want, but because I'm going to knit it top down and I have to turn things upside down in order to visualize them, like if I was going to knit from the bottom up, I'd say, oh, okay, it's this wide. That's how many stitches I cast on. I'm just going up straight for a while until I did some waist shaping. But I'm starting at the shoulders, and I need to do the shoulder shaping first. And I'm going in the other direction. So I always, trying to, right and left from the upside down. And then it's different when you're looking at the front from above versus the back from above. It's just a little bit of mental gymnastics. So that's something I'm going to have to work out this weekend so I can get started on it, because now that I know my plan, I'm excited to get started on this, and it'll be a little bit more interesting to knit, I think, than that 17th century stocking. I wanted to give you a little update on some sewing. I'm really enjoying this, and I know this is a knitting channel, but it's not a dyeing channel or a spinning channel, and I talk about that. I'm really, really enjoying sewing. I think it's because it's practical. I can make things just like that I can wear, just like with knitting, and they'll wear out over time, and I can make more of them. And you can make things other than clothing too. I don't see myself getting into quilt making. I think quilting is beautiful, but it's just not something I need. Like, we have enough blankets. We have so many blankets, and I don't want wall hangings. You know, it's like needlepoint. It's like beautiful, but how many needlepoint cushions and footstools do I need, or embroidered whatever? So there are things that I really appreciate the beauty of, but they aren't things that, for me, I'm just so, I think, practical in a lot of ways, that it's not something that I can see myself taking up. But making clothes is, because I hate to shop. But I like looking at buying yarn when I need it, or going to a fabric store when I need to, you know, getting the supplies for that. And I also know myself from years of knitting to know what not to do about accumulating stuff that I'm never going to use. So anyway, so I made this top. I bought it. It's called the Rhapsody top from Love Notions. And what I like about it is it's got different length sleeves. It's got like trumpet length sleeves, bishop sleeves, regular short sleeves. You can do it sleeveless. You can make it into a dress. And then these are what they call flutter sleeves. So I loved that idea, and I bought some really nice fabric at the fabric store where I'm taking my classes. It was expensive fabric, and I'm happy to pay that because I just don't shop that much. I don't mind paying a reasonable amount for clothing, and I don't mind making the clothes myself. But we have this kind of like fabric warehouse place. They've got 2 locations here, SR Harris, and they just have tons of fabric, and it's always 50% off. I went there knowing I wanted to make a few tops, and I found some fabric, including this one. So I thought, well, I'll make the Rhapsody blouse first from this. I think I paid $7 for this fabric, something like, maybe it's $10 because it was more than, I think it was $7 a yard or something. So it's pretty inexpensive, and I really liked it. And I thought, I'm choosing patterns just like I like to do with knitting, where I'm going to learn something new, some new techniques. So I thought this would be good practice, and then I'll know the techniques, and then I can make the one with the good fabric. So it's like a muslin, but it might be a wearable muslin. So I got it done. It's got gathers right here. It's got an inverted pleat in the back, and it also has a thread that needs to be trimmed. The yoke on the back, it's lined yoke, and I used what's called the burrito method, which was interesting because I had done a yoke on my linen dress, but it was done using a different technique. So that was nice to compare. I had to make bias binding for this one. I had to make bias binding for my linen shirt dress, but that was actually put around the armholes and then folded in to be like a facing. And this one, it's as part of the trim, that it's actually above the neckline, or surrounds the cut neckline and then turns into the ties. This bit was tricky. This V right here was tricky. So, and the flutter sleeve was interesting. It was just, it didn't take me very long, and I really enjoyed it. And I tried it on, and I thought, this is giving medical office vibes. And the thing is, I tried it on, and I really liked the way it fit. Because another thing that I did is that I'm learning with woven fabrics is that I need to make adjustments. And this is apparently true for many people, is that, you're not going to be exactly what the pattern is anticipating. I've always been lucky with sweaters where I haven't had to modify a sweater, but socks, you know my story on that. I have to make all kinds of modifications for my feet. But with woven fabrics, I do have to make an adjustment, because what I've learned is that they draft the pattern expecting what they call a B cup. And this isn't bra size B cups, this is sewing cups. So they're expecting that your high bust measurement around your underarm is 2 inches smaller than your bust. And if your bust is larger, you might need to do a full bust adjustment, or if your bust is smaller, you do a small bust adjustment. And my high bust and full bust are exactly the same, but I'm not flat chested. So that was very confusing to me until I figured out, oh, it's because my back is triangular shaped. So it's not, doesn't go straight up. It's triangular shaped. So my shoulders are slightly broad. And so I pick a size based on my high bust, and then I can grade it down below the underarms, down into the smaller size. So I learned to do that. That was fun. And then it fit. And I knew it fit. And then I knew then it would work for the expensive fabric. But so I tried it on. I went downstairs to where my husband was. Said it's giving medical office worker vibes. And he's like, yeah, I can kind of see that. And then he used my photo of this to generate an AI picture, which I will show to you. And you can tell me whether or not you agree that this shirt looks like somebody working in as a dental hygienist might wear. It's pretty, it's just the vibe. So this is a sleeveless top that I'm not going to finish. This is fabric I bought at a craft thrift store. So it's a thrift store that only sells craft supplies. When we were down in Chicago a couple of weeks ago, I went there thinking, oh, I'll see if there's anything that I could use to make one of these summer tops. And so I found this fabric. It's kind of, there's kind of a crepiness to it, like a little bit of a texture to it. And it had this pleat down the front. So I thought, oh, I can do, work on the pattern matching thing again. And what I realized as I was laying it out is that this is not a symmetrical plaid. You can see it better on the back. So just the way that this plaid lays out, there's like these little thin stripes here. It's very regular, it's just not symmetrical. And so when I put the pleat in, I got the pleat to line up, but I didn't feel like it looked symmetrical. But when I look at it on camera, actually it doesn't look that bad. I took it into my sewing class yesterday and I said, oh, this was a mistake. And she goes, no, you did it right. And I'm like, I don't know. And then the other thing was I had to make more bias binding. And this was using a different technique than I had done with my shirt dress, which acted as a facing and was on the inside, or with the previous blouse, which has it just surrounding the raw edge. This one surrounds the raw edge, but it's sewn from the inside first and then comes outside so that this fold is exposed. And it creates some like kind of three-dimensionality, which is kind of nice with this pleat. But the problem is that this fabric is kind of just loosely woven, or I don't know, it's just flimsy. And I did use starch to try to make the bias binding, but it just didn't work. Again, I had to grade this one, and this one had bust darts, and so I had to try to figure out how to grade it through the bust dart. So that was kind of interesting. So I did a reasonable job with the pattern matching. It's not perfect. It gets worse as it gets down here, but it was good practice. And the pattern was free. I got the large printout was free because I had a coupon, and I paid $6 for the fabric. So I feel like it was a really good lesson, and I'm glad I had that lesson, but this is not one I'm going to finish. That's what's going on in my sewing life. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below, or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rox Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.